3% podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%. I'm Chad Post from 3% and Open Letter, and I'm joined by Valerie Miles and Veronica Esposito, two of the members of the team at Granta that put together the most recent issue of the Best Young Spanish-language Novelists, Volume 2. Valerie was on the podcast a couple weeks ago to sort of set things up and frame it, and now they've read 67, 70%. I have six left to go. That we'd come back and convene and bring Veronica in to talk about different angles of the different stories, about what's been happening with the issue so far, about other publicity and marketing things that are going on, and all of that kind of stuff. So I don't know if there's any other introductions that need to be made at this point in time, but Valerie, what has been going on review-wise and coverage-wise for the issue in the weeks that have followed our last conversation?
Well,
you teed this up, so.
we have, it's been interesting. Largely very positive reviews, I have to admit, because there's certain very interesting elements of this issue that a lot of people are focusing on, which one of the really interesting things is the fact that, and that's been kind of repeated often, is the fact that this issue shows a lot of how the periphery, right, is coming into the center. There are a lot of writers that are off center. They're not from the large cities. They don't write about cities. They don't write about things in the center. A lot of times they're people, well, from different traditions in the countries, writing about more original peoples, writing about, kind of Indian cosmographies. So it's gathering in like a lot of people that aren't necessarily from the center, but that aren't afraid to write about their things anymore. They don't have to go through the center to write about it. Before, you had to like kind of write it whitely, right? And there's always this kind of like exoticism and not anymore. That's gone, and you can see that quite a bit. And a lot of the reviews are picking up on that. A lot of the reviews are a little bit angry. There's a question about some of the things in the introduction about what in Spanish is called la literatura del yo, which is writing from the first person. Kind of testimonial type writing that has been happening a lot in the Spanish language. Yes. And so we, in the introduction, I talk about selfies passed by Photoshop to call it fiction, right? Really basically somebody writing about themselves in the center of the photograph, and kind of, you can't see anything behind, right? So we mentioned that we got quite a bit of that type of writing, and that's not what we were looking at. And I think that's raised a few hackles. And because they don't really understand what we're trying to say. Or no, it's not that they don't understand what we're trying to say. I think people don't like what we're trying to say. Yeah. But we were really looking for imaginative fiction, right? Yeah. Not things that are kind of like fiction, but really aren't. We were looking for writers that were working from the imagination. So there's been a lot of questions about that. But then there's also the typical ad hominem attacks, about, as I was saying a little bit before, I suddenly turned into, in some cases, just the person who wrote the introduction, not the editor for 20 years of the magazine. Oh my God. Some people have mistaken us for like a Spanish institution. I kind of saying it's a British literary magazine that has a Spanish branch. A lot of kind of funny things. Also, a lot of the ad hominem are coming from guys at me, because for some reason there's kind of a resistance to how could like a woman be doing this, even in some, you would think that it's like that's over now. No, it's not entirely, but sometimes you just have to kind of take those things in stride, and I just laugh.
Are most of the reviews still coming out in Spain then?
Yes, they're still coming all over, quite a few now. Yeah, now the reviews are all coming out. That's very nice, because now you get to see people really reading. And I actually, Bill Buford in the 1990 1983 list, the second British list,
Yeah.
talks about a journalist who he had made an agreement with this journalist to give the exclusive of the list, right? And the earlier list had been the big 1983 list where, Salman Rushdie and Ian McEwan and Julian Barnes, Kazuo Ishiguro. So it was a big list, right? It was, they had to come up 10 years later on this really famous list. And so they gave this exclusive to a reporter, only for the reporter to write, to completely trash the issue, right? And so when Buford talked to the reporter, he found out that it was because the reporter knew that if he trashed it, he'd sell more copies.
Yeah.
And he would get a better post. He was actually gunning for a permanent post in the newspaper. So you can kind of see some of those, in the age of Twitter, it's easy to attack like people without attacking, but they don't attack the work, the actual work. Yeah.
Right.
That's what I was thinking. Like, isn't it just a lot of envy? Like
a
lot of dudes, like, who's this woman putting together this issue? Like, I know 20 better writers. Like I should be putting together this issue, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like that's probably fueling a lot of this. But
yeah.
I liked that you talked about people were engaging with the periphery.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I mean, to me, like, that is so important to just a lot of what I consider like Spanish language literature, especially like the literature of the Americas. Like when I think of like all the classic stuff that I really fell in love with, Latin American literature through, it's all these writers, right? Like all these people, these immigrants who were getting out like far away from their home, like from what was considered their home, going to these new places, eking out these lives on the periphery, and really like writing from that experience, like that experience of dislocation and migration and like nostalgia. To me, like those are a lot of the prevalent notes that continued through like the 20th century, right? And oh no, it's cool to see that still being such a prevalent thing, even though like things are very different now, obviously, with regard to like what's considered the center and what's considered the periphery. And even like, even if you have people writing from Spain itself, that still like that kind of, those thematics have kind of returned back to Spain. And even though you may be like in the geographic or the political center, you're still kind of writing from that stuff. So I don't know, I think that was cool. And I definitely noted that when I was reading it, when I was reading through the issue, and, that was something that made me feel good, made me feel like I could recognize this stuff and, really kind of bite into it. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's really interesting that you say that, Veronica, because, you could tell in a very major newspaper, there was an opinion column, and the person who wrote the opinion column very clearly did not even read it. So made like a number of mistakes that if he had read the introduction would not have. I mean, I'm not asking to read the whole thing, but the introduction might help.
Yeah. But
they hadn't read anything. So they made a lot of mistakes. And one of the things that they were trying to say was that it was from the same centers of power, which is exactly like the opposite of what now that everyone who's reading it is talking about how much it's coming from the periphery, right? But the thing is that they were saying that like Spain, there's 6 writers, right, from Spain. And that's the most. Then there's Mexico. There's 4 writers from Mexico and 3 writers from Argentina and 3 writers from Cuba. Of course, they didn't mention that there are 3 writers from Cuba, that center of literary publishing. But they, what they didn't bother to kind of look even closer at is that the writers in Spain are not from the center of Spain. One is from the Canary Islands. One is from Seville. 2 are from Granada, 1 is from Mallorca, and then 1 is from Barcelona, but the outskirts of Barcelona. So even the Spanish writers, they're not like Madrid, Barca,
Yeah.
There's no Madrid-Barca game here going on, which is what it used to be. It's like writers came, and maybe one from the north or something like that.
Yeah.
All of these writers are from very unusual places in Spain, and very, following, writing very much like in this, using the language and the sounds of the places that they're living in. And Spain actually lost a writer in the earlier issue. There were 7, and now there are only 6. And in the earlier issue, there were also 7 or 8. It depends on what you consider Andres Neumann, if he's Argentine or Spanish, and from Argentina. And in this issue, there's only 3. And we went from having 8 nations, represented, to 13. So it did spread out, a lot of the writing, and basically the difference is that there are these 3 Cuban writers that kind of suddenly, an eruption of a generation of Cuban writers who are now writing. But definitely what is true. Yeah.
I don't want to butcher her name, but Daenerys Machado Vento. That's hilarious.
I know.
Hilarious. But the one,
isn't it?
I love that. And you mentioned Seville, that Irene Reyes and Nogueira story.
Yes.
That fucked me up today. That was.
Oh, isn't it?
Yeah.
It
Totally, I read that on
me.
the porch with a cup of coffee, and I was like, okay, I can get back inside.
I'm going back inside.
Oh no, I need this. That was great.
She's wonderful, isn't she? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And she's the youngest one on the list.
Oh, wish I hadn't paid attention to the numbers.
Yeah. She's 23.
How old is she?
She wrote that
23.
Oh my God.
It's outrageous. Yeah.
That's wild. Yeah, I didn't notice that, but yeah, I thought that was one that I was like, this is one of the Spanish authors I'd heard of, I think all of them, and one way or another, and she was the one that I hadn't, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. This
because she's completely out of nowhere. She was somebody that she's only published in a small publishing house in the South. And that's another thing, Veronica, following what you were saying also, most of these writers, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are writers that are coming from very small indie imprints. And like Jose Ardila from Colombia, I know he's in Angosta, which is a very small independent imprint from Medellin, not even from Bogota. Right. And he's not even from Medellin. He's from Antioquia, from a small town in Antioquia on the coast. So there are really a lot of, it really is a selection. We did not bother with how much somebody's been in the newspapers, or how much. We really read on and selected based on hunches, intuitions about people's work, about what they were, about really exciting new voices that are bringing us things, that we haven't read before, that are telling us about things that I didn't even know I was interested in, and then you read it and all of a sudden you say, wow, I didn't know I could possibly be interested in that. And they just fascinated me,
I can't get over the fact that you had them write pieces last summer and that they worked for that seems crazy. I remember last summer and just not being able to really do a lot creatively, or feeling like it was a really hard, it was always very much felt like a challenge of this blanket of anxiety, and why bother, why this, when there's so much dread and fear and things going on. So to have pulled through that is a fairly, no matter what, is impressive. No matter what.
Yeah.
I have a question related to the reviews that are coming out now. So I suppose since there's a list and since it's constructed in said way, are there people that in the reviews that they're saying that X person was left out? Is there any consensus of the snubs or the or whatever you want to call it?
There's not a consensus.
Okay.
Of course, also because in the introduction, I mentioned some of the people that I would have liked to be on the list, but that for one reason or another couldn't be on the list.
Yeah.
Like Juan Gomez Parsna, for example, who, he's marvelous. He would have been in the list if it weren't for those 2 weeks he was born too early. Yeah. And so as people are actually reading, instead of just basing, a lot of people are trying to crunch numbers and they don't even get those right. Yeah, it's like crazy. One of the most interesting things about this issue also is identity, genre identity. They're really exploring issues of genre, really exploring issues of sexuality. I mean, throughout in really exciting ways. Polyamory, there's a trans character. There's, I mean, it's like fluid. It's very fluid. Yeah. There's one character that uses Spanish in a neutral, not neutral Spanish in the sense of it sounds like, but neutral genre. No, how do you say that? Gender neutral. Exactly. Gender neutral Spanish. The whole thing is gender neutral, which is absolutely extraordinary and not easy to do. Yeah. And so, people don't realize that sometimes. And so they try to crunch numbers and they can't, because if you don't read it, you don't know what some of these themes are coming through there. But so there isn't a lot of consensus on who shouldn't, like who we missed or anything, but I know there are going to be, there are obviously going to be people that are going to come up and that we missed, or that, I told you before that, for example, Emiliano Monge, right after he didn't make that list, he wrote one of the most extraordinary novels, no? And that happens. And sometimes you think, well, maybe it pushes people because they get angry and then they take the best out of them possible. Yeah. But going to what you were saying about making them work at this period of time that was really difficult, just very quickly, for me, that's why I said this in a way is kind of like a music of chance. Really what it represents is a moment in the collective unconscious of a group of really talented young writers who are writing in the Spanish language in many different variations. No, so it's like the Goldberg variations. And it's like this kind of a moment in time. The language is the same, and then it's all the possible variations of this language of what this generation is living in this moment. That's what we wanted to capture.
It's
let me just jump in on that for a sec. I think that kind of goes back to what you were talking about. I think the both of you kind of touched on this, just like bringing Valerie's instincts and like your intuition to the selection of this list. Because I mean, God, like summer 2020, that was so long ago, like in very real ways. I don't know that anyone really could have meaningfully predicted like what would feel relevant right now, from that vantage point. And I think like that's kind of what good writing is, like good editing is, that you can put down something that's really going to transcend that moment that you're stuck in, and then that is going to be valid no matter what happens, in the world over the course of the next 12 months. To me, I think that's great writing. And that's like what you're looking for, right? Like when you're an editor, like when you're trying to like pick these people, they're going to like be this representation of something. I think that's the kind of stuff, those are the notes that you're kind of trying to hear when you're doing that editing. And I don't know, like to me, that kind of connects with this other question you're talking about like making this list, and who did we leave off, who did we miss, which is like, I don't know, it's kind of like such a tired question, because you're picking like what, like 24 writers maybe, and there's so many people, like how many writers are out there in the Spanish speaking world, right? And obviously this is going to be a very kind of curated selection of people, and it's not going to represent everyone. That's that's not what these things are about. But then like you put this list out here, and and you come from like this periodical that really represents something and is like seen in this kind of really high stature. And it's just, I don't know, I feel like people get challenged and they're like,
Yes.
that's not a list. Like, I'll show you a list or what. And I don't know, like to me, that's really beside the point. Like that's never what this exercise was intended to be. Like that's not what this kind of thing is about. I don't know. Like, I guess I'm kind of curious, Valerie, like if you wanted to go here to like just talk about like obviously that's not what this issue is supposed to be, right? It's not like the
No,
final list of all time. Like
absolutely
what is
not.
this supposed to be?
It's very funny that you say that, Veronica, because, and this goes with Chad's question too, about, what are the reviews? And it's really funny because everybody is kind of very focusing, saying, this is the new canon. They were looking for a new canon. They wanted to change the canon. That's what a lot of the reviews are saying. And I keep thinking, no, we really didn't want to change anything. That's not, we weren't looking to establish a canon. And we weren't like saying these are these are all of the only best writers that are out there, and there are no more, or none of those kind of things. Everybody knows that, juries are, in a way, sometimes when you create a jury, what you see in the results of the jury are the ways that the prejudices of the in the way that they read, not prejudice. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, the things that I like, I might like a certain style of writing that is different than somebody else's style of writing. And then you get a jury together, and that whole kind of collective will move. Like I said in the introduction, I call it like playing the Ouija board. No, it's like everything's just kind of moving, and a different jury is going to bring on it would be a different list, because there'd be a different kind of element. But that's why I kind of I look at this in a different kind of a way. I look at it as, like I said, a whole music of chance, because you're putting together a series of elements that kind of all create it's like chance, because it's this jury, and the jury meets at this time, and the jury's reading these writers, and what's happening outside of us. We're in the middle of a pandemic. All of these things go together to we know that you can read something on one day and you read it on the next day and it's not the same thing, of course. And we were looking for writing that was alive in that way, and writers who seemed like they were the kind of writers that it didn't matter, Instagram doesn't matter. Like the writers of the old-fashioned kind of writers it's really about the writing. It's really about the work. And we just were looking for, this is a moment in time. This is a group of writers. There are a lot of really good writers. Not all of the good writers are in this issue, but all of the writers that are in the issue are very good writers.
One of the things that's worth pointing out too, just in case anyone missed this or didn't know, and changes, I think, some of the criticisms around it, is it's not like you got together and picked out writers from the world based on your own knowledge. There were only 194 eligible in nominations. So you're picking the 25 from 194. So like
exactly
12% make it, which is a very low percentage. But if you looked at everyone from the Spanish world, there's probably thousands that could have theoretically been nominated in art. So it's not like you're choosing from everything. You got a very specific like grouping of it. And so I think that to me like defangs the idea of like who's left off, even, or we don't know who's eligible, who's nominated, who's on that. Like you don't have any clue. So, and that makes it that I think like sort of tempers that for me, at least.
Well, we had a group of very disgruntled Venezuelan people because it was not a Venezuelan on the list. And I mean, we're talking very disgruntled, right? And the person who wrote a tweet getting started said, I didn't make the 2010 list, but because my editors never bothered to send my book in to be considered. So I never had to worry about not being chosen because, my editors never followed through. But Granta is obviating and ignoring Venezuelan literature, right? And I kind of thought, well, we only got one Venezuelan person to send their thing. And, I can do as much as I can to send the information out, to talk to editors, to talk to agents, to talk to journalists, to talk to reviewers, to talk to as many people as I possibly can. But if somebody doesn't send in the book, then they're not on the list. And, it's not up to us to do. We did a lot of prospection. We did as much as we possibly can, but I can't pull the book out of their fists so that they actually, become a candidate. That has to be done. And it also kind of tells me that if you didn't, maybe you aren't somebody who cares that much. You know what I mean? Or I don't know. But for some reason, it didn't seem important enough to send that in, and so after the fact, you can't kind of be disgruntled that you didn't make it on the list.
Yep.
And not only that, there was only one Venezuelan in the selection. And we mentioned in the introduction that we read and enjoyed her work. So it's not, it was a writer that was not ignored. It was a writer that was given the mention, but it was the only one that bothered to send something in. So, so you can also tell yourself what does that say about the institutions or the editors or, the journalists that weren't getting their writers onto as candidates too. No, there could be it would be a wonderful moment. We know how difficult it is for people to do it, but to do a little bit of self-criticism as to, why maybe some of these things don't happen. And I have all of the statistics for anybody who would like to see them about how many candidacies we got per country. And for me, the fact that, for example, Africa is a part of this issue, right? And there weren't that many, which means we really did get the news of the candidacy out there.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, they came from a lot of places around the world. We had candidacies from the Philippines. We had candidacies from a lot of places around the world. So it's not like we didn't do a good job about getting the word out there,
I also, I liked your point about this can also be like a spark or something for people who weren't on the list. Because I mean, especially again, going back to Latin American literature, right? There's this whole anti-contrarian streak. I mean, what would Roberto Bolaño have thought about being left off a list like this, or Cesar Iver? I mean, you can imagine the responses, right?
Of course.
And there is that whole element to the writing. And I think people, if they're feeling different ways about not being on this list, or just something like this existing in the first place, that itself can become meat. It can become grist. Yes. And I think that can be really productive for people.
Of course it can. That's what Fresan said.
Exactly. So I mean, I don't know, I like the idea of being part of someone's growth, right? Looking at it from a point of view of self-critique, or kind of taking the fact that you weren't on this list for whatever reason and processing that, and then integrating that into your practice. I don't know, I think that could be really productive for folks in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
Well,
sometimes working against is it gives you a lot of energy, and writing sometimes really great writing can come out of that energy. And not only that, it's shaking things up is never a bad thing to do. It's never a bad thing to do. Yeah. Because there are the Hay Festival has Bogota 39. There's 10 of 30 that they're doing in the IFC that Katie's been translating. There are a lot of these things that are happening where, you know, you make selections and people get on or don't get on, or, you know, of course, Granta has like 40 years and it's not an institution. So, you know, it's a little bit different because it's, you know, it's a literary magazine. It's a little bit different than like kind of more of an institution putting together a selection. But it's just really good. It's what it's meant to do is you can't add everybody because it's impossible. So in a way, you're just making a selection at, like I said, at a moment in time of very good writers, and giving an opportunity for them to write, also to be translated. And so that we can see a little bit, it gives us just a tool, an instrument of seeing what's going on.
Yeah.
What's happening. And it allows us also to compare with 2010. So, and any comparatist knows that having something to compare already gives you like a huge amount of information that you can consider and look at.
Yeah. So you are probably in the worst position to talk about which pieces you like the best. But I have to say one of the things that stood out to me that's interesting is all the speculative and sci-fi pieces that I keep coming across. I find those very those are some of my favorites so far. Like I even read a couple this morning, like the one from Andrea Chapella. That's a great story too. And the one that I think you had mentioned of the Garcia Elizondo one that was a Frazan sort of like Philip K. Dick reference.
The Philip K. Dick, exactly. And Vonnegut. Philip K. Dick and Vonnegut axis, exactly.
there's that for Frazan, and then there's like Nabokov, like
exactly
now. But yeah, I think it's really interesting the sort of sci-fi elements to it, and that is a different sort of periphery from what we were talking about in terms of identity politics or identity representations and of like the geographical space. But as a genre, it's not really like considered high literature to 99% of the people that are involved. And I don't remember now, but were there any in 2010? I don't remember there being anything that was speculative or sci-fi at all. No. And now it's like there's enough, and they are like varying degrees. So in the Garcia Elizondo story is like prisoners who are condemned to death. It's so much cheaper than to like keep them in prison as they just put them in a ball, shoot them into space.
And giving them some pills, you know.
They got a button to like when they're ready to kill themselves. Like that is very dark. But then there's like Andrea's one is in the future, but it's a future that's very realistic, in which like the climate has ruined everything, and that it's not about that. It's not that sci-fi. That sci-fi is a setting for her to remember this poly experience that she had in Spain, or almost had. And you got that. And then like the Dengue Boy one is different too, where it's like mutations and it's way in the future and uses that in a different way. But it's really curious to me, like how that seems to be elevated. Oh, and the stones, the statues. I can't think of the.
Yeah, exactly.
There's so many titles. There's so many names. But yeah, is it Sea of Stone? Yeah, Sea of Stone is another version of that, in which like the science fiction, the speculation is that suddenly people just like are
disappear.
They disappear.
Exactly. And turn into statues. Exactly.
It's really interesting, like the way that can be taking that part of like the writing world and bringing it into a center as well. And having it in here is like a really strong statement in a way that you wouldn't normally I guess I wouldn't have expected all the time from Granta.
It's very interesting because I think that is, for example, this is helping us see, in a way, I think the Bolano Effect. Bolano loved science fiction. Philip K. Dick was one of his most important authors. He wrote The Spirit of Science Fiction, but there's a lot of other elements, fantastic elements to his writing. And in a way, he kind of opened the door to consider that science fiction doesn't, which we understand it as genre, has come out of that genre as and can be considered higher in a different way. And I think that's one of the Bolano effects. I also think the use of humor, there's a lot of humor. They're very, very funny stories.
Yeah.
And varying degrees of whether it's straight humor, like the natives, or it's more just irony or tongue in cheek, or, you know, sarcasm, or even caustic sarcasm. No, but there are varying degrees of parody and satire, which I think is really interesting, which is also something that was missing from the 2010 list. It was much more kind of straight, realist fiction, sometimes a little bit odd. Andres Barba's piece, I remember, was about a woman who wanted to put a horn. You know, she was into plastic surgery. She was like a porn artist, and she was into plastic surgery so much that her biggest thing in life was to put a horn, you know, on her forehead. So it was odd, but it was still a real person, just, you know, kind of crazy. But most of them were like straight realist fiction, set in urban settings, a very neutral kind of Spanish. If you took away the geographic markers, you wouldn't know if it was Buenos Aires or Madrid. But this one is very different. The genres are different. They're using language in very creative, very exciting ways. There's a desire to use language, you know, and like I say, in its sonorant qualities, in the sense that when you're reading the Cuban writers, you have a Cuban accent in your mind's ear, you know. You have a Cuban accent. It's impossible not to read it Cubanly. Now, of course, in the translation, you can't appreciate that as much, but the translators have done an extraordinary job, and they didn't have this was not an easy translate. Not like the issue in 2010. This was much more complicated, and especially Megan McDowell in her extraordinary translation of Paulina Flores, the one who wrote in this, gender neutral Spanish. She had to do that in English, which was quite extraordinary how she did that.
I make a correction for what we said on the first podcast. Is there are actually 24 translators, because there's 2 for One Piece. We left some out.
No, they're 23, because Megan translated 3.
Yeah, that
she has 3 writers.
I think we said 22 last time. Sorry, we left that off. You said that and we counted backwards instead of adding on the one other person that was there. I don't want them to get left off, as Lindsay Griffiths and Adrian Esposito. So.
Oh yes. Oh, that's right. Of course. Thank you, because I'm saying 23, but actually the one has 2.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And they did an extraordinary job.
Yeah, they're all
because Jose Ardila, that was hard, because there's a lot of code. There was a lot of code in that story, and they did a really good job.
So. Do you have any other ones that you want to point people to?
I'm not allowed. Veronica, help. What do you think, Veronica? What were the stories that you have been liking? Is there anyone you would like to?
That's a hard one. That's a hard one to say. I would definitely say, along the lines of the translations, I feel like I was noticing people just seem a lot more comfortable and just a lot more aware of kind of letting that translation stuff be a little more visible in the story. I don't know, I feel like things that maybe 10 or 20 years ago would have been a lot more invisible, like things that were happening in the Spanish that just would have remained invisible in the translation. They were a lot more apparent. They were more kind of with the texture of the stories. And, I like that. I thought that was really cool, and just kind of bespeaks like this new generation of translators and this kind of savviness on the part of the English language reader, where I think like editors, publishers, writers are just a lot more confident kind of putting that in people's hands and letting that be a feature of the stories. Like that was something that I really valued about just looking through this issue. I think like the satire was kind of cool. Like I noticed there was like a lot of pretty vicious satire of things like self-care or things like social media, which I don't know. I mean, it was funny, right? Because like those things are really appealing. Like I'm reading these stories, I'm like, ooh, like I want to try that. Like I want to make that smoothie. I want to take that yoga class. But then it was also like really acid, like this really harsh wit. And I don't know, maybe
Very.
that was also kind of like speaking to the point in time at which these things were being written. Like maybe people were just really sick of Instagram because that was all they had for socializing. Or maybe,
Yeah.
people were sick of being told 500 times, yeah, we're in the middle of a pandemic, you have to take care of yourself. And they're kind
Mhm.
of writing out of that opposition, like F
Mhm.
this. I'm sick and tired of taking care of myself.
I wonder too, like for writing at that period of time of last summer, like the speculative and science fiction thing is like a kind of a relief. Cause like if you're writing
Mhm.
about the now, what is now? Like I was proofing the 10 of 30 during the beginning of the pandemic last time. And there was
Mhm.
like one of the stories, I don't remember the author's name at this moment. I could give enough clues that would give away who it is. I don't want to be insulting about it necessarily, but they reference that like, oh, it's like 2012 or 2016, something like that. And like, this is the worst year that anyone could ever have lived through. Like things have become so horrible at this moment in time for society and it sucks. And it's like, no, you don't know.
Mm.
like
Yeah,
you're
you
listening
don't
to
know
this,
what's coming.
oh, that doesn't age well, but that's not entirely your fault. Speaking of the translators, I'm looking because I have my printout of like which ones I've read and they're checked off because I do it sort of
Mhm.
randomly. Here are the 6 translators I have left to read pieces from just to illustrate the level of quality in the issue. Christina McSweeney, Katie Silver,
Mhm.
Margaret Del
Mm.
Costa, Danny Hahn, Julia Sanchez, and Samantha Schnee are the six
Oh my gosh.
that I haven't gotten to yet.
Like imagine that's like star-studded, right?
Right. That would be like you would think like, oh, if you went by that, those would be the top, but there's like so many other people on here, like the
Yeah.
aforementioned Megan McDowell, Francis Riddle, Lizzie Davis, Kelsey, Nick Caster. There's so many people that are like talented there in it. And like, so I just noticed looking there and like, oh Jesus, this is like the heavy hitters part is coming now. Too. There's another round of it that I have. So
Well, one kind of responding to Veronica's question or comment to this issue, really what it's meant, and that's why it's published in English as well as in Spanish. It really meant uh, also more than anything to bring just a group of really, really good writers into the English language to show what's going on here. To show that there is right now a real vibrancy in the Spanish literary scene is very, very hot right now. It's on fire. There are, I can say a little bit like, aside from really extraordinary, some really extraordinary cinema people and other things, maybe like Spanish products, cultural products in other areas, are not always the very best, but writing is world class.
yeah.
It's world class. What's coming out of the Spanish language is world class. But, we all know, Chad knows better than most, how difficult it is to get things out into translation and out to the, general audience. And this was just a really marvelous opportunity to share. Like, this is what the young people are doing. Okay, so just imagine the people who are veteran and have been around for a little while and haven't been translated yet. It's just like, that's what we're trying to say. We're trying to say, read this, people, and tell me if there isn't really, really extraordinary writing in this language. And there's things that they're talking about. I mean, Latin America still has so much to tell about itself, so much, and that's like Miluska Benavides, for example. She is writing about areas of Peru, that are still unsung. We're going to be doing a conversation with Joseph Zarate. I don't know if you know who he is, Joseph Zarate, who's also Peruvian, and he writes he writes more reportage, but he writes a lot of things that Miluska also writes about, which is like the generations of migrants that came from like the Amazon and came from the Sierra and came to Lima, which were their grandparents' generations. And they came with all of this knowledge, right, of the kind of natural world and a certain kind of sensibility that is different, like doesn't look at landscape as what I can exploit, but like what is the beauty of the landscape, right? And so how they came into Peru and had to like migrate and learn how to make their way without completely losing themselves in their traditions, no? And they're like now going back to those, retelling now those stories that were lost because they were, you know, people coming from poor areas, there were poor migrants, they didn't even have anyone who could write them, you know? And so now this new generation is going back and taking up all of their stories. So there are so many things that people are writing about that we don't know. So it's new, it's like brand new stuff for an American readership. And you know, it's really important for us. Traditions can get tired and old and exhausted, and they need fresh things to come in to spark, whether it's technical things or perspectives or areas that themes and subjects and historical areas that people are dealing with in new and different ways. And we need that in order to show us how the rest of the world is telling their stories, right? And so what this issue is meant to do is to help us in the English language renew ourselves,
right,
with new stories.
Which would be, which is really like one of those good things about translation as a whole, of that is the way to enthuse or infuse something interesting into the traditions and the language and the points of view and everything.
And I think it's amazing I think it's just really quickly, it's amazing that magazine like Granta, you know, with the prestige that it has, will dedicate an entire issue to a language that's not English. Yeah. When you talk about leap of faith, no, it's like a real leap of faith that they take, and I think it's something that should be celebrated as much as possible.
Veronica, I know you have a question or a comment, but real quick with that, do you know if there are any other plans for the other Grantas and the other languages to do a similar sort of list that maybe doesn't get published in this way, but is within their own country?
I'm sure that slowly but surely, you know, there was a Japanese issue that was it wasn't like the best of, but it was a Japanese kind of young Japanese writing issue. That's an extraordinary issue. The Brazilian one, exactly. There was a Brazilian issue. I'm not sure what plans are in the works, but since the Spanish was the one that started everything, so we had the 2010, so ours had to be now. I'm sure probably other languages will do some other languages. I don't know which ones, but they're probably in the works.
It would be great.
Yeah, I think so too.
So Veronica, go. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I wanted to speak about along the lines of what you're saying about the newness or the spark or whatever. I'm curious about like the cross-pollination that's going to be happening because of this issue. I mean, now you have this constellation of writers and translators that are linked in this way. You know, they've all been brought together for this particular reason, and I know that there already have been some events with them, and there are going to be upcoming events. I know we're working on, Valerie, and I guess just, you know, bringing these people together who may not have ever had the chance to really kind of immerse themselves in each other's work or connect, you know, in ways, you know, I'm just thinking about that being something that is going to be rejuvenating for people and their writing practices. I don't know, I'm curious about what you may have noticed with like the 2010 list, you know, the extent to which things like that were happening or weren't happening, and you know what may be already brewing with the group of writers on this list.
It'll be interesting to see. I think so, so far with this new list, it's a little early yet to be able to tell. But I think there's always an element of cross-pollination, and there's always, when you're opening like a new world of writing, it's in many ways, it can be very different. I know that many of the writers who were on that 2010 list and have gone on to continue writing, like Andres Barba, or Andres Neumann, or Carlos Labé, for example. Carlos Labé, who is one of the really experimental writers on the 2010 list.
Yeah.
I know he has, affected a lot of people in the way that he's been writing, because he even writes, he has a lot of French kind of influence, Libyan influence, and he was experimental in a way that showed a lot of people, I think, ways forward in different forms. Now, this list, I think it'll be very interesting to see who does that in what ways. But since this list is, like you were saying, Chad, there are elements of science fiction, there are elements of cross-genre. There are people doing like really interesting things with like the idea of image and text, like Carlos Fonseca, or where art and literature meet each other, the plastic arts and image, text and image, where they kind of move together. And I think those, like Carlos Fonseca and his piece, is very interested in architecture, very interested in space, very interested in like the kind of dream architecture. I think that would be one of the stories also that could probably have influence in certain writers.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think Aura Garcia Junco, which you were talking about earlier, the one about the statues that disappear.
Yeah.
I think that is what she's doing is very interesting. There's a play, a very meta-literary play with using elements that are not text, like maps or
that, yeah,
just posters and things like that, that suddenly kind of jump into the text. So there's a sense of, like the space is being used. It's very spatial. It's being used in very interesting ways, where you have the story and you have the text itself, but then you have things that are always kind of breaking into the texts and bringing you into another level, no diegetical level. So yeah, it'll be interesting. I think there'll be a lot for people to kind of get in there. And I think what is also interesting for a country that has read Bolano so deeply, it'll be interesting for writers to see how Bolano has been affecting a generation in his language.
Yeah. Absolutely. But I know that, Veronica, you had somewhat of a time constraint here, so we can probably wrap things up. Especially, I wanted to hear if you guys have, I know of a couple of them, but what events do you have planned that are coming up next? And how has that been going so far? Because I missed the one that I wanted to go to. I was on a different meeting Zoom endlessly. but alas. What things do you guys have planned, and what things do you have in the works?
Veronica, would you like to talk about it? Or?
Yeah, well, I know that, well, maybe, I'll give an overview, and if you want to go into the details, Valerie, I know that there's going to be an awesome event. I think the second US event tomorrow, which I'm not sure, I guess maybe that'll be yesterday or last week, depending on when.
Today.
Oh, okay, well then it's really going to be tomorrow with the Brooklyn Library, which I think is going to be a really awesome way to start things off. I know Valerie and some authors will be there alongside Andy Tepper, who's just such a great person pushing translated literature in a lot of different ways. I know that we've been working on something with Brazos, hopefully
Mhm.
to be a part of their summer programming, bringing together some of the women writers from this issue. They have a whole big thing planned for the summer to do a lot of different writing by women in lots of different forms. So this is going to be an event in
I'm going to
conjunction
interrupt you.
with
Why don't you
that.
plug your event? Isn't your
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, and I'm going to be part of the Brazos events. I guess that's going to be on July 8th, and I'm going to be moderating a group of amazing women translators, and a lot of people who were in this issue. So, there's going to be some crossover there. Definitely check that out, July 8th. It's going to be a Zoom thing, so you can see it wherever you are. And I think, we just got some word recently that it looks like we're going to be able to do something in conjunction with the Brooklyn Book Festival, down the line in the fall. So that's going to be another really cool event. And yeah, and maybe Valerie, if you want to talk a little bit about like the specifics of like who's going to be in these events and that kind of thing.
Well, tomorrow will be Mateo Garcia Elizondo, Miluska Benavides, and Monica Ojeda. So the Ecuadorian writer, Peruvian writer, and Mexican writer, with Andy Tepper. And then there's also an event that is going to be on the 26th of June that is just being kind of set up. And it's going to be an in-person event in Fort Lauderdale, a
Nice.
bookstore, a signing, which is just now kind of getting put together, but Michel Nieva will be there, and Daenerys Machado Vento will be there. So the Cuban writer and the Argentine writer, and they're the two writers that are currently living in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be in a bookstore there in Fort Lauderdale. I don't know if this is just like Ben's kind of happening today. So I'm not sure if we'll do anything else, but since we're going to be there in person, that's like so exciting to me. It's just the idea of being in person.
I know.
But then we have like a number of different things, a Hay Festival event coming up in Wales with Cristina Morales, Andrea Abreu, and Irene Reyes Noguerol. If you're interested in hearing them, it'll be in English. So it's the Hay Festival, and since it's by Zoom, anybody can join us. That's on June 6th. We have another event but that's here in Catalunya. We're going to be in Querétaro in Mexico. We're going to be in Arequipa in Peru. We're going to be in Guadalajara for the Guadalajara Book Fair. I mean, it's kind of all starting now. We'll have a number of events kind of throughout the year, and we have a website, Granta, the Spanish Granta website, which is granta.com.es, where we're going to keep, all of the events are there for anybody who would like to come in and kind of keep up with what we're doing. So, and each place has, different writers and different groups. And for me, it's fascinating because I get a chance to, I've been working with them for so long, but now I get to see them with each other, talking to each other. It's so exciting to hear, the Ecuadorian writer talking to the Peruvian writer, talking to the Mexican writer, talking to the writer from the Canary Islands. This huge world full of stories, all kind of coming together now and talking to each other of a same generation. It's quite fascinating. I consider it. I'm having the time of my life.
Awesome.
Yeah, this is the nice part, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
put in all that hard work reading all the submissions and having to deal with those macho critics who are responding to the list. And now you get to be out there and just,
Travel the
talking
world.
about this
Having
stuff
fun.
with people. That's amazing.
Yeah, having fun and celebrating. And now it's just a big celebration. And, And for me, this is simply for all of the writers who are out there who are marvelous writers. There were so many writers that I loved, and and that pain you, because it's a painful process having to make a selection. It really is, because there are a lot of writers that I really wanted on the list, but it's a jury, and so you have to make concessions so that everybody has their role. But what we're saying, what our message is there's so much going on in the language, and there's so many great writers, not only these ones. These are just some of the really, really great writers that are in the language. And by bringing attention to the fact that this is happening in the language, everyone gets a chance to be heard, I believe.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both for joining me. And I'll have links to all of the events in the show notes to this. So if anyone's interested, you can find them there, or like you said, go to granta.com.es and they're listed there as well. So any final words anyone wants to throw out there?
Well, I could say thank you. Thank you very much, Chad, for having me again. And thank you, Veronica, for being with us. And
I'm really glad you could join us.
for all the work that you're doing. Veronica is a big part of our team. And it's a joy to work with you, especially because Veronica also wrote for Spanish Granta in the past. She's also one of our writers.
Yes.
Yes, well, that was a great issue.
Yeah,
that was a great issue.
This was a lot of fun. It's always fun being on your podcast, Chad. So
yeah,
you know how fun your podcast is.
I'll say one last thing. That you inspired me. So reading this was because this happened, I think, last time too. I was like, I don't ever read a literary magazine or a journal from cover to cover. Like that's very rare. And so for our other podcast, for the 2-month review, we might throw in a couple episodes in between seasons in which we just read a literary magazine fully and discuss it in that way as a whole, as a book, rather than as like the individual pieces or whatever, but address that, because it really is valuable, and it's interesting to like go through that process of actually not just cherry picking the names, reading the ones that you don't know as well.
Well, that's something I'm really glad you brought that up. That could be my last comment then, because it really is done that way. We did not put this issue. It's not alphabetical order. It's put together. There's like a secret code.
I think I know some of your codes, because you said a couple of them. But there's the music, but then there's the statues. Exactly.
The movement, the statue suite in 3 movements.
Yes.
And there is a reason. I don't know if I would say reason. There's a sensitivity. There's a little whispering that's going on that is the reason why it has been set this way, because it's how the stories create a whole, and it was done how the constellation is set. As a matter of fact, I have a funny picture of the table when I had all of the, when I was doing this, I had all of the pieces set on the table, and I was kind of moving them around, almost playing them, like moving one here, moving this one there, moving this one there, moving this one there, until like finally I kind of realized, the underground music to the issue. So it does have a reason.
Well, you should make that visible. When you were talking about the plastic, the visual kind of breaking in to some of the stories, I feel like that would be a cool thing to like have out there in some form for folks who are trying to figure out what y'all were doing with the order of things.
Yeah. And it that's why I always think like careful readers, like I like to make a little bit of a wink to readers who are really very like careful readers. They're deep readers, they're rereaders, because like once you read the whole issue, then you have the image of it, and then you can start filling it in and trying to understand why this one was here and why that one was there and why this one is here and why the statue suite is placed there and not there. And so it does have a plastic element. There's a canvas. It's a canvas.
Well, before we wrap up, I just want to say, Valerie, I always pleasure just to sit and listen to you talk about books. It's like an education, right? Like every time I have a meeting with you or a podcast or whatever, and just to hear you like talk about Latin American literature, it's just
Thank you, Veronica. It's very sweet. Thank you for those words. I guess I can't hide the passion I feel for it, I guess. It's kind of hard. Oh, well.
Well, thank you both again. And stay tuned
thank you, Chad, too, for your series. Maybe you want to mention your series.
Yeah, I'm writing about them as I go. That's why I've been reading in random order, is to try and throw things together and do some weird meditation on value and success. And that will be ongoing. I was going to write one today, but I think I'll do it tomorrow. But it'll be done by the end of May. I didn't realize May 31st is on a Monday. That's a key element of my life. It's like, whoo,
that calendar.
But we also have five of the translators are reading pieces either by themselves or with someone else that are going to be out there as videos. The first one's up is Kelsey Beneda reading her piece and talking about it. Marvelous. And framing it in an extra interesting way, because we do have within this like the short bios, but that doesn't give you a lot. And so like how this came about with Kelsey talking about how they went to Iowa together and like what their interactions were on and related to the other books that she'd written and all of this like really like enhances that story or that experience. So yeah, stay tuned, everyone. Have fun. They'll all be wild and weird like usual. So good.
All right.
We wouldn't expect anything else.
I know. It wouldn't be Chad without it.
It wouldn't be Chad, exactly.
Be fun.